So it's a great pleasure today. So many of you have come, and you know why. Misha's a great speaker. And a few things about her. She's by far the best dressed scientist in this entire place. Misha's a great scientist. She's done an amazing PhD. She's done an absolutely brilliant PhD. Scientifically, it's really cool, and you'll see much of that coming out from her talk today. But beyond that, Misha's been absolutely brilliant at integrating with the broader network of people around this flyway who are trying to save these shorebirds. And it's been amazing to watch her leadership grow over that time. Misha's worked on a whole range of issues, from local stuff right here in Moreton Bay through to really big flyway and bigger initiatives. And it's just been amazing to watch that. She's widely respected around the flyway, and her services are called upon all the time to provide input into various policy developments and all sorts of things that are happening around this flyway. So it's been amazing watching you, Misha, over the course of your PhD, and she's going to take us through a tour de force of what she's been doing over the last few years today. Thank you very much, Misha.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you guys all so much for coming. Sorry about the stuff up with the equipment before we got started. So I've just handed in my PhD in January. Thanks in great part to my wonderful supervisors, Martine and Rich. I've had so much fun doing this PhD. It's been a real pleasure. So today is just a bit of a wander through all of the findings from the PhD and a few thoughts to sort of come out at the end of it. Oh, this isn't going to work now either. How exciting. It's great. Okay, so for those of you who may have heard some of this before, I wanted to keep you entertained. So at the top of every other slide is a picture of a shorebird. It's a shorebird that I took the photo of that was somewhere in the flyway. So there's no, really insidious, birds from other flyways snuck in there or something. So grab your pencils if anyone uses those anymore, or your phones. And if you keep track of the birds as we go, I have some awesome prizes at the end for anyone who gets all of them right. All right, I'm sure I don't have to tell this room of people that wetlands are important, right? We all know that wetlands support a huge amount of biodiversity around the world. There's lots of different types of wetlands, and wetlands also provide us with minor ecosystem services like cleaning the air and water, protecting our coast from storms, supporting fisheries, etc., etc., etc. But we are doing a fabulous job of getting rid of all our natural wetlands around the world. Between 1970 and 2015, wetlands actually disappeared at 3 times the rate of global forests, even though I think we tend to hear more about forest loss. In addition, a lot of the wetlands that are left are highly degraded, so they suffer from pollution, from toxic algal blooms, invasive species, you name it. And we've also done a great job of converting the world's natural wetlands into artificial ones. So 1/3 of the wetlands around the world are now actually artificial wetlands, things like reservoirs, or rice paddies, sewage treatment plants, etc., etc. Shorebirds. Shorebirds are the best. You all know how much you love shorebirds. So shorebirds are actually a fairly loose group from a sort of phylogenetic perspective, but what they share is morphological characteristics that make them good at shallow water foraging. So one of the most striking things that people think about when they think about shorebirds, if they think about them at all, are their amazing bills. So shorebirds have all different kinds of bills. They generally have fairly long legs relative to their body size, and all of these different types of bills are adapted to getting different types of prey, but most of that prey lives in shallow, muddy environments. And that means that most shorebirds are very, very dependent on wetlands as far as their habitat use goes. So I just want to say something about coastal shorebirds, because the focus of my PhD was largely on coastal shorebirds. Not all shorebirds are coastal, but many of them are. And an important thing about coastal shorebirds is that their daily movements, for the most part, are more driven by the tide than they are by whether it's daytime or nighttime. Hopefully this is going to work. So each of these little balls of light, imagine it's a shorebird, and just see what happens. So you can see pretty quickly that essentially as the tide goes out, these birds are spreading out onto what we call the intertidal flats. So this is the part of the coast that is exposed at low tide and covered by seawater at high tide, the muddy bit. And you can see as the tide comes in that shorebirds tend to bunch together in a much tighter group than at lower tides. And what they're doing is what we call roosting. So this is a period of rest, sleep, digestion, maybe a bit of feather cleaning that the birds can do while they wait for their foraging grounds to become exposed again. So not all shorebirds behave like this, but a lot of coastal shorebirds do. Equally, while not all shorebirds are coastal, not all shorebirds migrate, but lots of shorebirds do migrate. I'm sure you know that you are a resident of the East Asian Australasian Flyway. This is an area that we've designated because about 50 million waterbirds, including lots of different shorebird species, move through this area in a fairly predictable way every single year. And a lot of birds have a life history that looks something like this. This is the Curley Sandpiper, one of my favorite, and I reckon one of the more underloved shorebirds of our Flyway. Brilliantly illustrated by Millie Formby. If you've never seen her stuff, check out her website. She's amazing. So this is the Curley Sandpiper. It hangs out in Australia and parts of Southeast Asia during the austral summer. And then it moves up through coastal areas of East Asia up onto breeding grounds. And shorebird breeding grounds in our Flyway can be in Alaska, in Siberia, northern China, other parts of Russia. So not all shorebirds migrate, but those that do undertake some of the most spectacular and longest distance movements of any animals on Earth. However, in our Flyway, the coastal areas that shorebirds move through are very, very crowded. The eastern seaboards of East Asia support some of the most densely populated human places anywhere on Earth. So a huge amount of the world's population actually lives along the eastern seaboards of Asia. And as a result of this, we've lost a lot of coastal wetlands. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Nick Murray's paper from 2014. So this map here shows the Yellow Sea, which encompasses coastlines of China and both Koreas. And what Nick found through some new remote sensing techniques is that about 2/3 of the intertidal flats, so that area I said where shorebirds like to feed, have actually been lost in the last 50 years. So if you look at this map, every single one of those places that is in red is a grid square that has experienced 100% loss of tidal flats. So it's a pretty serious situation for wetlands, and the areas that shorebirds move through while they're migrating, they have to contend with lots and lots of people. And as a result, I'm sure many of you are aware that we've seen some fairly alarming declines in some migratory shorebird species. And a paper that came out in 2017, led by Colin Studds, showed pretty convincingly that there's a strong relationship between shorebirds' dependence on moving through the Yellow Sea on migration and how fast they're declining. So the more they depend on the Yellow Sea during migration, the faster their decline rate. And so that's a really, people have known this for ages. There's lots of people monitoring shorebirds locally. People have been saying since the 1970s that we're seeing shorebird declines linked to habitat loss. But this is sort of a nice, easy way to package that up and get that message across really clearly. We also have some resident shorebirds or non-migratory shorebirds that aren't doing well. In Australia, we have things like the painted snipe. In New Zealand, there's quite a few critically endangered resident shorebird species and a few others in East Asia as well. So it's not just migrants that are not faring well. So before I sort of get into the findings, I just wanted to have everyone think about this idea of human-dominated landscapes and how wildlife gets on in these places. So has anyone been to Singapore recently? Anyone seen the smooth-coated otters in Singapore? It's an amazing sort of success story. So now you can go to Singapore, super densely populated city, and you can see these otters just casually moving through the streets in lots of different places. Right? So we know from the work of the Greenfire Lab and other colleagues that the rate of global wilderness loss is catastrophic. It's ridiculous. And we know that it's incredibly important to conserve remaining wilderness areas. But because we have developed so much of the world's surface, there's a lot of wildlife that has to move through human-dominated areas for at least part of its life cycle. And some species even thrive in this situation. Look no further than the noisy miner, loves human-dominated areas. But for the most part, as in the case of the otters, wildlife is trying to figure out how it can navigate these human-dominated spaces and doing better and worse for various different factors. So that's really a theme of my PhD, and I just wanted to sort of have people think about that before we get started. So the first chapter of my PhD, which as of 2 days ago is now in press with biological conservation, I guess it was at least as good as the cats, hopefully. So what we wanted to do here is, I mentioned earlier that about 1/3 of the wetlands in the world now are actually artificial wetlands. And we know from lots of different local studies, including even here in Moreton Bay, that shorebirds in big numbers use artificial wetlands, things like rice paddies or dredge spoil ponds inside of ports. And so people had looked at this on a local level, but there wasn't really a good synthesis of this at a sort of Flyway scale. So that's what we were trying to get at in this paper. We wanted to know how extensively are artificial habitats used by non-breeding shorebirds throughout the Flyway? How do shorebird abundance and richness and the way species are using these habitats vary across different types of artificial habitats? What's their sort of ecological function in the daily life or the migration ecology of the birds? And are there anthropogenic pressures that could affect the suitability of these habitats for the birds? So what did we find? Well, I think this map shows pretty well that use of artificial habitats is pretty pervasive throughout the Flyway. So each of these circles, and you can see what the land use types are on the right, is a place that at least 100 shorebirds have been counted in a single count on an artificial habitat. Okay, so we found that this occurred for 83 species, so that's pretty much all of them, and certainly all of the regularly occurring coastal species. We found, so this is 176 different sites, and there's probably lots more that we missed. As you can see, they're spread across these 8 land uses, and 36 different species, including 11 threatened species, occurred in internationally important numbers. And what we mean by this is that more than 1% of the population occurred at one of these sites during at least one single count. So not across time, but at one point in time. So lots of birds occur on artificial habitats across the Flyway. We did pick up some patterns in terms of which shorebirds use artificial habitats more often. So as far as occurrence frequency went, we found that threatened shorebirds were significantly less likely to occur on artificial habitats. And we found that larger shorebirds, migratory shorebirds, and coastal specialist shorebirds were less likely to be feeding on artificial habitats. What do I mean by coastal specialists? So in general, in non-breeding areas, we can put shorebirds into 3 boxes. Coastal specialists, so ones that we pretty much see exclusively along the coast. Generalists, who appear at both inland wetlands and along the coast. And inland specialists, who we mostly see away from the coast, specializing in sort of freshwater wetland use. And so even though all of these sites were on the coast, coastal specialist birds were much less likely to be feeding in them. So this suggests that there are certain characteristics about shorebirds that make them more and less able to utilize artificial habitats. We'll talk about that more later. We also found some distinct patterns across the different types of land uses. So we found that, so the blue bars here are the average count at these types of sites, and the red ones are the density, so how many shorebirds per hectare. So we found that wastewater treatment ponds, salt production ponds, and port and power ponds, so these are usually dredge spoil ponds inside like a power station or a port, had by far the biggest mean counts of birds. But the density was highest, again on port and power sites, and on constructed roosts. So constructed roosts is not surprising. It's usually a small area that we actually build for shorebirds, specifically to use at high tide. So it's not surprising that the density is a bit higher on those. Quite distinctively, we found that both agriculture and aquaculture, although there was lots of different sites where shorebirds occurred on these 2 land use types, they generally had much smaller mean counts and very low density. So as far as thinking about managing those sites, that could be a bit more challenging, because it seems like, well, maybe on these sites the birds are quite spread out. So one of the main things we sort of found when we looked qualitatively at threats to these types of habitats is that saltworks, you'll remember, hosted the largest mean count of shorebirds across the Flyway, but we found stories over and over again that saltworks are being converted or shut down and etc. So quite a lot of saltworks in Australia have ceased production. Quite a lot of saltworks in China that used to host lots of birds are just completely gone now. There's lots of urban expansion pressure on salt pans from Thailand. And so I think we could look to other models like this one in the East Atlantic Flyway, where they actually have a sort of semi-formal network that helps to connect up the managers of saltwork sites, and it actually promotes the value of traditional salt farming, not just for birds, but also for people. So I think there's an opportunity for us to look at a Flyway level at our salt pans and promote some of the values of them. So a huge number of people helped to put this together. It's very difficult to put together shorebird data from our whole Flyway because it's a bit all over the shop. So I'm eternally grateful to these many, many people and organizations that helped with this one. Alright, so in the second chapter, what I wanted to do was get my hands, or mostly my boots, a bit dirtier and look at this issue on the ground. So this paper is published in Ecology and Evolution, if you want to take a look. So before I talk about the findings, I just want to go back a bit to one of the reasons why we lose intertidal flats. And that is this process of land reclamation. So land reclamation's been going on throughout the world, and in China as an example, for probably thousands of years. But certainly intensely in the last few decades. So how this works is, so imagine that this is the ocean and this is the land, right? We've got this intermediate area, this intertidal zone. So this part that's sometimes wet, sometimes dry, not really land, not really sea. And we call straight in from there the supertidal zone. So this sort of coastal strip that's right next to the intertidal zone. And when we do a land reclamation project, and of course, so like I said before, shorebirds are often foraging on that intertidal bit and roosting on that supertidal bit. So when we do a reclamation project, what we do is we put a seawall somewhere out in the intertidal zone, and we actually cut that area off from the tide, so it no longer gets inundated with seawater. And what that does is it creates a whole speck of new land in the sort of supertidal zone. So it creates new supertidal area at the expense of intertidal flats. And of course, by definition, everything in this reclaimed area is really artificial habitat because it's now dry land, whereas it used to be intertidal. So all of that land that's now things you can build on top of, etc., wasn't there before. And so of course, reclaimed areas tend to be very heavily human dominated. So this is an example from one of the important shorebird sites in China. So along here, this is a seawall. So that's been a reclamation project. We've got the mudflats still out here. But inside, in this new reclaim zone, we have everything from reservoirs to aquaculture ponds, solar farms, chemical factories, etc., etc. Lots of different land uses, all of which are pretty industrialized, pretty human-dominated. So what we wanted to look at in this site was we wanted to look at a place that was a really important stopover or staging site. So somewhere along that migration pathway that birds don't necessarily stay there for a long time, but it's a really critical area where they can rest and refuel in order to complete their migration successfully. So this region is a few hours north of Shanghai in Jiangsu province, and we looked at 5 different sites along about 120 kilometers of coast. And these are what each of our sites looks like. And as you can sort of see, even just from these pictures, each of the sites we looked at, there was a seawall. That was the coast. So no natural coastline left in any of these sites. So what did we find? Well, we found across the 3 months of southern migration, so that's August, September, October, anywhere between 21 and 36,000 shorebirds were using artificial habitats. So lots and lots of birds were using artificial habitats. And this was across 37 different species just in this one place. We had internationally important counts of lots of different birds, including spoon-billed sandpiper and Nordman's greenshank, critically endangered and endangered species. Okay, this is actually a bit of a show-off video for the bird nerds here, but I'll pretend that it's related to my talk. Okay, so what we also found is that for the most part, birds were not feeding in artificial habitats where we studied. For the most part, they weren't feeding. And for the most part, they were only using these habitats at high tide. So when the mudflats were actually available, the birds were not there. And when the mudflats were covered up, that's when we found lots of birds in these sites. And just to give you an example, it's sort of on topic. Oh no, maybe I won't even be able to. Oh yes, there we go. Okay, so have a look at this. You should be able to see 2 distinctly different types of birds. One type of bird is feeding like crazy, and the other one's just being lazy and standing around or having a bath. No. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this bird, and this bird are spoon-billed sandpipers, and if you watch them, they are feeding like crazy. And this is in a drained fish pond, so a fish pond where the farmers actually lowered the water level. And if you look at these other guys, that one there, this one, they're just standing around or having a bath. They're really not feeding. So even at the same artificial site, different species were doing different things. So if we just look at the whole shorebird assemblage, we don't really get the whole picture. So it turns out that spoonies actually in multiple places in the Flyway love drainfish ponds, and no one had ever, we had 20 spoonbill sandpipers in this pond over 2 days. It's just a ridiculous count. There's only about 210 odd pairs left. So some portion of the world population just in this fish pond. So it's really important that we pay attention to what individual species are doing as well. So we then started to think about, okay, well, why are we seeing so many shorebirds in artificial habitats here? And what are some of the things that determine why they go to this place and not this place in and amongst that reclaimed landscape? So firstly, this is the 5 regions we looked at, and these are the number of days per month that the mudflat was actually covered at high tide. So during that time, the sea was basically hitting the seawall, and there was nowhere for the birds to go except artificial habitats. So essentially in this region, for a certain number of days per month, all the birds are using artificial habitats because there's really nothing else available. And we did find a correlation between the number of days that the tidal flats were covered and how many birds we saw. So this is how many days per month that the place was covered, and this is the number of birds. And you can see in general that the birds preferred to hang out in the places that had more access to the mudflats. Makes perfect sense. We also found some strong signals that there are certain biophysical characteristics that the birds prefer about artificial habitats. So on the left side is the minus, and on the right side is the plus. So they didn't like too much water, they didn't like too much vegetation, and they didn't like too many structures around the pond. And these second two are very much related to predation. So shorebirds are often predated by aerial raptors. So if there's lots of things around the pond for birds of prey to sit on, you're more likely to get eaten. And if there's vegetation, you don't have a good field of view, so you can't see your predators as easily. On the pluses, they liked bigger ponds. They liked, obviously this is not really they liked, this is they were more likely to be there when the tidal flats were not available, as we talked about. And they also liked it if there was an unvegetated bund. So to explain this, it's easier to use a picture. So in a lot of these ponds, the water level was too high for the birds to be in the ponds, but on the banks around the pond, we hated them, and if there was no vegetation on them, we sometimes got lots of birds. So that's really just kind of a different measure of vegetation, really. So from all this, we concluded essentially that shorebirds are using natural intertidal flats and supratidal artificial habitats in an interconnected way across the tide cycle. And so when we look at these coastal areas in lots of heavily developed places, we need to be managing them as such. And there was a complimentary paper that came out from a colleague of mine, Jimmy Choi, and he sort of showed that in protected areas, we do a better job at protecting this for shorebirds than we do this. And in some ways that makes sense because it's harder to do management perhaps in places where there's lots of people doing lots of busy things like harvesting fish, etc. So I just want to acknowledge my amazing field partner, Spoon-billed Sandpiper in China, Fudan and NUS hosted me at various times, and an Endeavour Research Fellowship funded travel, etc. Okay, so for the next chapter, what we decided to do was take another look at this artificial habitat issue in Australia, where we have access to really good long-term monitoring data sets, sort of unique in the Flyway in a way. There's a few different places where we have this, but Australia is a good example. So what we did was we went back to that first chapter and we looked at all the places where we found at least 100 shorebirds on an artificial habitat, and then we looked at where those were distributed in Australia. And in those places we sort of identified that overall region, and what we wanted to do was actually look not just at the artificial habitats, but how prevalent was the use of artificial versus natural habitats at high tide. What sort of spread across the shorebirds in each region was going between these two types of habitats. And then we thought we could look at, well, has the proportion of birds that use artificial habitats changed over time? Because in some regions of Australia we have like a 30-year plus data set. So we can see whether this has changed over time. Not just for the whole shorebird assemblage, but also at a species-specific level. And then we wanted to see whether we can explain some of the variation in this proportion using species traits, and we wanted to see if that sort of squared with what we found at the Flyway scale in Chapter 1. Brad, this amazing figure summarizes everything we found in one little blob. Great. So the size of the circles here is, if it's a bigger circle, it's a closer proportion to 1 of the birds that were using artificial habitats. If the color is closer to blue, that means that the proportion increased over time, and if it's closer to yellow, it decreased over time. And those are the 5 regions along the bottom and the species on the side. So to summarize this figure, across the different regions, we had a pretty big proportion of shorebirds using artificial habitats in all the regions we looked at, but it was very much higher in places that are more developed. So that makes sense. Places like the Hunter Estuary, almost every bird was using artificial habitats at high tide. Through to Darwin, Darwin's not that, the coast of Darwin's not that developed, and so we had more like around 15%. But still sizable in all of these regions, clearly still an important component of high tide habitat in all of these regions. So if we looked at the sort of 75 species regions combinations we had, more than half of the birds used artificial habitats at high tide. So that probably even more than the top statistic shows you that these habitats are really important across all the regions. However, we only found 9 significant increases and 3 significant decreases across this. So for the most part, we found that once an artificial habitat is established in an area and it has attracted birds, the use of that habitat seems to be fairly consistent over time, which is helpful for management, I think. We did find, again, some pretty strong patterns in terms of which birds we find there, stronger patterns than in the Flyway scale study. So we find that migratory, threatened, and coastal specialist species are likely to have a lower proportion of birds using artificial habitats at high tide. And so in Australia, unlike in the situation in China where there's really no choice at high tide, in these regions where there was sort of a mix of artificial and natural habitats, these certain types of birds expressed a preference towards natural habitat use over artificial habitat use. Just want to acknowledge the 3 partners who help with the data in this: BirdLife Australia, Queensland Wader Study Group, locally based, and the Hunter Bird Observers Club. All right, chapter last. So the last chapter of the PhD switched gears a little bit and looked at plants instead of birds. How amazing. So what we were looking at here is a threat to shorebird habitat that is prevalent in China. It was really obvious during my field study in China. We saw this a lot. And this is an invasive grass, Spartina alterniflora, that threatens both intertidal habitats and supertidal artificial habitats for shorebirds. So Spartina is a perennial grass that's native to the Atlantic coast of North America. We think about it as an ecosystem engineer, and that's just a fancy way of saying that it sort of fundamentally alters key ecosystem processes. So this grass tends to spread first laterally and then seaward along intertidal flats, and it ends up forming these really dense meadows, sometimes up to 2 meters tall. And it kind of promotes accretion in the soil, so the elevation actually tends to rise over time. And in general, what this is doing is it's drying out the mudflat from the landward edge outward. And so this grass was introduced to China on purpose in 1979 to help with erosion and also to help pave the way for reclamation projects. And by 2015, it covered about 550 square kilometers. And we often hear people talk about Spartina as a threat to shorebirds at international meetings, but surprisingly, there's very little literature about the relationship between Spartina and shorebirds in the Flyway. So we looked at this really on a pretty simple level. We just wanted to know, okay, well, what's the extent of Spartina across important shorebird sites, basically? So all the places where we've seen internationally important numbers of shorebirds, how does this overlap with the distribution of Spartina? We also wanted to look at, for those same set of sites, what does the situation look like in terms of intertidal flats, because there's obviously many other processes, including reclamation, things to do with sea level rise, changes in hydrology that cause changes in tidal flats as well. And so since Spartina spreads along tidal flats, if you have loss of tidal flats from something else, like reclamation, for example, these are sort of 2 threats squeezing the same habitat at the same time. So we sort of felt like, well, Spartina is interesting, but looking at it in relation to what's going on with the tidal flats more generally is really important. And then where do these 2 threats intersect, of course? So what did we find? Well, across the sites we looked at, the total area of intertidal flats decreased by about 15% in 15 years. That's really quite a striking amount. And at 75% of each individual site, there was a decrease in tidal flats. As for Spartina, it occurred at 28 of 52 sites, so over half of the important sites in shorebird sites in China have some Spartina on them. And it covered more than 5% of the total area at 6 sites. That might not sound like a lot, but because Spartina spreads along the coastal side of tidal flats, that's actually the most important part of the tidal flats in general for shorebirds. So 5% is actually quite a lot. And so of the sites that had Spartina, about 80% of them also had tidal flat decrease. So on top of that, there was about 8 more sites that there was an infestation close by, so the Spartina is definitely threatening that site in the near term. So from this, we sort of got that, okay, yes, Spartina is a major threat to shorebird habitat. Because it's quite widespread over those maps, it really probably requires national coordination and control. Controlling it at individual sites probably won't be sufficient. The threat of Spartina is clustered in certain provinces listed here. And experience from elsewhere, so places like Western North America and Europe that have had this same problem, suggests that, like lots of things, controlling it earlier is a lot easier and a lot cheaper than leaving it. In lots of places, there's now been like multi-decade effort to get rid of this thing, and it involves putting a lot of chemical input into the system, which is obviously not ideal. So just want to acknowledge the top paper there is where we got our Spartina data set from, and the bottom 2 papers are where we got the important shorebird sites from. Okay, so what does this whole mess mean? It is sort of nice that we do still do PhDs and not just published papers, because that sort of last chapter, it makes you think about, well, why did I do all these different things? Why was I looking at plants here and running around in China here? What was I doing? And so it is nice to kind of reflect on how does all this pull together, and what are the really key things that you feel like you want to get across to people. So I hope you weren't paying attention till now, because you really just need to see this slide. So artificial habitat use by shorebirds in our flyway is widespread across coastal non-breeding areas, and sometimes it's obligatory. So in these places where all the tidal flats are covered and there's really no natural habitat in the super tidal zone, that's where shorebirds have to go, somewhere onto artificial habitats. And we found more than once, I didn't talk about this in the Australian case study, but it's also the case there, that saltworks are particularly important. We found that shorebirds definitely prefer certain characteristics of artificial habitats, and these largely square with findings from previous studies about what shorebirds like at high tide. Shorebird occurrence on artificial habitats varies among species, so we have to be really, really careful not to talk about shorebirds, just like I've been doing for the last 40 minutes, because shorebirds are not one thing, even phylogenetically they're not one thing, so we need to think about individual species when we get down to the nitty-gritty of management. In heavily developed coastal regions of the Flyway, artificial and natural wetlands form this interconnected landscape. And this comprises both roosting and foraging habitat, and in some cases, shorebirds are foraging a lot in artificial habitats. So we need to look at both of these types of habitats together. So those are sort of the kind of research findings, and what we, and of course, Spartina. I think that's fresh in your memory. So what do we conclude from all this? I think that probably one key message is that securing high-quality, high-tide roosting habitat for shorebirds in highly developed non-breeding areas would be highly complementary to conserving remaining natural habitats, and it would reduce some of the pressure on shorebird populations. As a result of coastal development history, a lot of these high-tide roosts will be artificial or modified habitats, and as a result of that, we're mostly going to need active management to make sure that those places have the characteristics that the birds actually like. And I will say that along the way, we, our author groups, etc., do cop a lot of criticism sometimes for even looking at these habitats, because people interpret that as, well, you're giving policymakers or developers or whoever an easy way out by saying that shorebirds like artificial habitats. You're sort of implying that it's fine to get rid of the natural ones. So it is a bit of a subtlety of this, and I really want to stress that nothing that we found suggests that that's really the case. Okay, for the most part, shorebirds are jointly reliant on natural habitats, and in some cases, artificial habitats, particularly at high tide. And so, better integration of these habitats into the frameworks that we use both inside protected areas and outside of them, would reflect a more holistic approach to habitat protection. A formal conservation framework for salt production I think would be a really interesting and fun project to get up in the Flyway. And developing a national plan for Spartina control in China is needed in order to make sure that these coastal shorebird habitat sites have high quality habitat, still have enough food in them, and in turn prevent further habitat related population declines. So, not going too badly for time, I'll just maybe spend sort of 5 minutes thinking about a few sort of spin-offs from all of this. So as far as where to from here, I think looking at responses of shorebirds to change conditions on artificial habitats through some actual structured manipulative experiments would be really useful, because most of what we know now is just from looking at birds and the accidental situations that are created on artificial habitats. And I think that would help us develop species-specific practices as far as management and possibly even offsets go. I think a formal review of land use pressures, which I always intended to do in this PhD and did not get around to doing, would help us to identify threatened artificial sites and in the long term to prioritize high value, high risk sites. Something that we know very little about is the effects of pollutions on shorebirds. There's a little bit of work that's been done on how much pollutants they have in them, but we don't really know how that affects them. And in turn, we don't really know what the pollutant levels in some of these artificial habitats are, but you would assume that they're probably higher than they are in natural habitats. So I think that's something we do need to look at, and potentially we might even want to deter birds from foraging if we find that there are elevated pollutant levels. Sort of similarly, there are lots of shorebirds that do sometimes feed in artificial habitats, and there's like sort of a feeding frenzy will happen when certain brine shrimp larvae hatch and stuff like this. But it's possible that the quality of that high abundance prey is like junk food for shorebirds. It might not actually be as high in quality as like the broccoli that you get out on the mudflat. And so if that's the case, again, we may want to think about deterring the birds from foraging in these areas. Finally, I think something really exciting, so I really hope that we're past the days of building seawalls and we're going to start knocking them down. So I think a next step is looking at the reconnection of supertidal and intertidal habitats, doing some trial reconnections, and then looking at a prioritization exercise where we see where this would have the most benefit for birds, and maybe for people too. Just touching briefly on some sort of general limitations in the way that we approach this. I think there's a clear lack of sort of socioeconomic context or research in my PhD, which is really useful, of course, when you're looking at human production areas. So other people have done some cool work on this. This is a project led by TNC in America where they incentivize farmers to actually provide habitat for shorebirds. So there's some really cool stuff out there. Also, Jonathan Green has looked at this to some extent in Thailand, in shorebird sites, and I think more work like this that sort of explicitly links ecology and socioeconomic context together is really useful. Also, I only looked at some sort of specific threats to shorebirds, but in order to manage them effectively, we need to consider the whole suite of threats that they're facing. So some of the threats I didn't look at, lots of you will know Ed Gallo-Cadgio. He just got an amazing Smith Fellowship over in the US, so jealous. He's done some great work looking at rates of shorebird hunting around the Flyway. We also get accidental bycatch, so sometimes shorebirds get caught in fishing nets that weren't meant for them, but they end up drowning or something like that. So that's an important threat. When I went to China, I found a profusion of prey items for myself. I gained so much weight when I was in China. The food was amazing, so good. But unfortunately for shorebirds, there's a few shorebird sites where their prey items are not there in the quantities we expect. So there's been a few instances of catastrophic food shortages. There's been some research into this in Moreton Bay, I understand, as well, and some really worrying signs that the benthic fauna is not consistent in sites where shorebirds really need it to be there. So that's something we have to think about. So we have to think about not just conserving the extent of tidal flats, but along with Spartina, the prey quality of intertidal flats needs to be maintained over time. And finally, I didn't look at sea level rise. Of course, a lot of these are low elevation coastal sites, and so sea level rise is going to play a big part of this story in the longer term. Finally, I just wanted to mention a few international frameworks that this work relates to. As far as Ramsar and CMS go, so Ramsar lists internationally important wetland sites, right? And Ramsar has been willing to include artificial sites in their listings for a very long time. And there have also been some resolutions passed more recently, both through Ramsar and CMS, just sort of explicitly acknowledging how important intertidal flats are, but also how important these working coastal wetlands next to them can be. So working coastal wetlands is another term we use a lot nowadays to talk about these sites that are important for biodiversity, but are also human production activities. The East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, they also have a Flyway site network, and a number of these sites include artificial habitat as well. But the Flyway Partnership also has quite a lot of task force and working groups where they look at specific issues, and there hasn't been one for working coastal wetlands yet, so maybe that could be useful in future. Finally, I'm going to end a shorebird talk of all things on a good news story. How amazing. When we talked about shorebirds, 2 years ago, it was all doom and gloom, it was terrible. But fortunately, we've seen some new policy developments, particularly from China in the last few years, that make the outlook a bit rosier for shorebirds. And in particular, both China and South Korea have proposed new serial site nominations that are comprised all of intertidal sites along their coastlines. So this is really exciting. And in China, the first phase of this nomination has actually gone through. So this is one of the study sites I was at during my fieldwork, and believe it or not, this is the most important site, stopover site, anywhere in the world for spoonbill sandpipers. And when I started going there in 2016, there was a big sign, and it had a picture of this beautiful reclamation that was going to put all of this habitat under concrete. And now, 3 years later, it's a World Heritage Site. And the sign is now a World Heritage Sign instead of the reclamation plan site. So that's really, really exciting. Rich and other people from Australia worked really hard to make sure that nomination got through. So what we need to do now is make sure that South Korea and the second part of China's nomination are successful. And we also need to make sure that people are thinking about the management of these sites. But I think if all of those sites are ultimately protected, it makes the outlook for shorebirds a lot better than it was even just a few years ago. So on that happy note, I'll leave it there.